You think life transformation requires years of gradual change and incremental progress? Maslow discovered something that challenges conventional wisdom about how development happens. In his research on self-actualized individuals, he found that while most growth is gradual, certain people experience what he called quantum leaps, sudden shifts in consciousness or understanding that reorganize their entire psychological structure in remarkably short time. These psychologically mature people weren't slowly inching toward change. They were having breakthrough moments that fundamentally altered their trajectory. The most important part? Maslow identified that these turning points weren't random or magical. They followed specific psychological conditions and involved what he called a shift in the center of gravity of consciousness. This isn't about instant transformation through positive thinking or single techniques. This is about understanding how genuine psychological reorganization happens and what conditions make sudden developmental leaps possible versus the gradual change that characterizes most growth. And recognizing the difference between insight moments and integration work prevents the trap of believing that understanding equals transformation. Not every dramatic moment produces lasting change. There's a critical difference between temporary insight that fades and genuine turning points that permanently alter your developmental trajectory. Maslow observed that many people had powerful moments of clarity, realizations about what they needed to change, peak experiences that showed them different possibilities, crises that shattered old structures, but most returned to their previous patterns within weeks or months. The insight was real, but it didn't translate to transformation because the psychological conditions for integration weren't present. But the pattern he documented in genuine turning points was different. These were moments where insight combined with readiness, where understanding met sufficient development to support reorganization, where the person was psychologically prepared to build new structures rather than just seeing the inadequacy of old ones. This wasn't magic or willpower. This was development reaching a threshold where change became possible in ways it hadn't been before. What appears as sudden transformation is actually the culmination of extensive preparation, meeting a catalyzing moment. Real turning points, according to Maslow's research, require both the insight and the developmental readiness to integrate what the insight reveals. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow discovered about genuine turning points in psychological development, the conditions that make sudden shifts possible, why most insights don't produce lasting change, and what distinguishes moments that genuinely reorganize your life from temporary clarity that fades. You'll discover psychological prerequisites for turning points, the specific types of insights that catalyze transformation versus those that remain intellectual, and why attempt to force change before you're developmentally ready usually backfires. These are insights from humanistic psychology about how actual transformation happens, distinguishing between the myth of instant change and the reality of prepared consciousness meeting catalyzing moments. By the end, you'll understand what makes some moments genuinely transformative and others just temporarily inspiring. This isn't a video promising you can transform your life with one decision, one technique, or one day of effort. This is psychology explaining how genuine turning points work and why they're both rarer and more possible than most people understand. This video is for people who've had powerful insights that didn't translate to lasting change and want to understand why, or for those sensing they're approaching a significant shift and want to understand how to work with it. If you've had moments of clarity that faded, if you've understood what needs to change but haven't been able to implement it, if you're exhausted from trying to force transformation that won't stick, you're about to understand the actual psychology of turning points. But critical warning, understanding this won't create instant change. It will reveal what conditions need to be present for change to become possible. If you're ready to understand how genuine transformation actually happens, keep watching. Think about a moment in your life when something clicked, a realization that changed how you understood yourself, a decision that altered your trajectory, an experience that showed you something you couldn't unsee. Notice what happened after that moment. For most people, there's initial excitement and energy, maybe some behavior change, but within weeks or months are back to familiar patterns. The insight was real, but it didn't reorganize the underlying psychological structure, so old patterns reasserted themselves. This is the normal pattern, insight without transformation. Maslow understood that seeing what needs to change and having the developmental capacity to actually change are entirely different things. You can understand intellectually that you need better boundaries healthier relationships, different career, or authentic self-expression, while being developmentally unprepared to implement those changes. The insight arrives before the readiness. But sometimes, rarely but genuinely, insight meets readiness and something fundamentally shifts. Maslow called these growth crises or quantum leaps, moments where accumulated development reaches critical mass and a catalyzing experience reorganizes consciousness around a new center. The psychological way to these genuine turning points is that they don't feel like willpower or effort. They feel like recognition. You're not forcing change. You're finally able to implement understanding that's been building without your conscious awareness. The old structure has weakened enough, and the new structure is strengthened enough that the shift, when it comes, feels both sudden and completely natural. Maslow's hierarchy explains why turning points only happen at certain developmental thresholds and why attempting them prematurely usually fails. At each level of the hierarchy, you're building psychological structures, ways of meeting needs, patterns of relating, identity formations, meaning-making frameworks. These structures serve you at that developmental stage. But as you grow, you eventually outgrow them. They become limiting rather than supportive. This creates what Maslow called growing pains, discomfort from operating with structures that no longer fit your development. Here's where turning points become possible. When old structures are clearly inadequate, but you've developed enough that new structures are available. That gap between outgrowing what was and being ready for what's next is where quantum leaps happen. If you try to leap before you're ready, before new structures are sufficiently developed, you fall back because there's nothing to land on. You return to old patterns because they're the only stable structures available. This is why willpower-based change so often fails. You're trying to force new behavior without the underlying developmental structures to support it. But when development has progressed sufficiently, when new structures exist, even if you haven't consciously recognized them, a catalyzing moment can shift you from one stable state to another. Here's the insight that changes everything. Genuine turning points aren't about creating something new through effort. They're about recognizing and inhabiting development that's already occurred beneath conscious awareness. The shift feels sudden, but it's actually the culmination of extensive preparation. You've been developing capacity for change without knowing it, and the turning point is when that capacity becomes conscious and integrated. Maslow found this pattern consistently. People experienced what felt like sudden transformation, but detailed examination revealed years of incremental development that made the sudden shift possible. The turning point was real, but it required all the preparation that preceded it. The psychologist William James studied what he called conversion experiences, moments where people's entire orientation to life shifted dramatically. His research documented both religious conversions and secular life transformations that shared common features. They followed periods of intense internal conflict or crisis. They involved sudden resolution, where everything reorganized around a new center, and they produced lasting behavioral and experiential changes. James concluded these weren't supernatural events, but natural psychological processes, where accumulated tension reached threshold and consciousness reorganized into new stable configuration. The psychiatrist Milton Erickson pioneered brief therapy approaches based on recognizing that people are often closer to change than they realize. They've done most of the developmental work, but haven't yet made the shift. His therapeutic interventions were designed to catalyze turning points in people who were developmentally ready, but psychologically stuck. His success rate suggested that genuine readiness can translate to transformation more quickly than traditional therapy assumed, but only when the readiness is genuinely present rather than wished for. The cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter studied how insight works in problem solving and found that aha moments follow specific patterns. Extensive preparation where you're working on a problem unsuccessfully, a period of incubation where you stop actively working on it, and sudden insight where the solution appears complete. He found that the preparation phase is essential. Insights don't come randomly, but emerge from groundwork that makes them possible. This pattern appears to apply to psychological development as well. The turning point requires the preparation, even when the shift feels sudden. The philosopher William Irvine studied Stoic philosophy and modern psychology, documenting that major life changes typically follow what he calls trichotomy of control, understanding, recognizing what you can control, what you can't, and what you can influence. Turning points often involve suddenly seeing this clearly in ways that permanently alter behavior. Insider knowledge from therapy and developmental psychology confirms what Maslow documented. Sudden shifts are possible, but they require preparation that makes the shift sustainable rather than temporary. But here's what Maslow discovered about the specific conditions that make genuine turning points possible versus temporary insights that fade. The first condition is what he called completion of prior stage. You cannot leap to the next developmental level until you've substantially satisfied the needs of your current level. Attempting transformation before completing current stage work creates unstable change that collapses back. If you're still working on basic security, turning points around self-actualization aren't stable yet. If you're still building self-esteem, transcendence-level insights won't integrate. The turning point must match your actual developmental readiness. Second condition is sufficient pain or limitation from current structure. Turning points typically require that your current way of being has become clearly inadequate. It's causing suffering, limiting you obviously, or preventing something you genuinely want. Without this discomfort, motivation for the disruption of change doesn't exist. You need your current structure to be problematic enough that change feels necessary rather than optional. Third condition is glimpse or model of alternative structure. You need to have seen, through peak experience, through observing others, through imagination, that a different way of being is possible. Without this glimpse, you don't know what you're moving toward. So change has no direction. The alternative doesn't need to be fully understood, but it needs to be sensed as real possibility. Fourth condition is withdrawal of investment from old structure before turning points. People typically go through a period where they stop fully investing in their current life structure, the relationship, career, identity, or way of being that they're outgrowing. They're still functioning within it, but they're no longer pouring energy into maintaining it. This withdrawal is essential preparation. It weakens old structure enough that new structure can emerge. The fifth condition Maslow identified is readiness to tolerate transition chaos. Between old structure breaking down and new structure solidifying, there's always a period of disorganization. Turning points require willingness to enter this chaos rather than immediately grabbing for new stability that might just be old patterns reconfigured. You have to be developmentally mature enough to tolerate not knowing, not having clear structure, being in transition without panicking back to familiar ground. Sixth condition is support or permission from environment or internalized figures. Major changes happen more readily when something in your environment supports them. A person who believes in you, circumstances that require change, cultural permission, or internalized voices, parent, mentor, teaching, that authorize a shift. Without support, change feels like complete isolation, which increases resistance. Seventh condition, and perhaps most crucial, is what Maslow called self-actualization pressure. The internal drive toward becoming more fully yourself that emerges once deficiency needs are met. This pressure builds gradually as you develop, creating increasing discomfort with living inauthentically or below your potential. When this pressure reaches critical intensity, turning points become not just possible but necessary. You can no longer tolerate the gap between who you are and how you're living. These 7 conditions cluster together in genuine turning points. You rarely have all 7 perfectly in place, but the more present they are, the more likely insight will translate to lasting transformation rather than temporary inspiration. Understanding these conditions helps you assess whether you're actually ready for major change or whether you need more developmental preparation first. Attempting to force turning points before conditions are present usually leads to failed change attempts that damage confidence and create cynicism about growth being possible. The transformation that occurs when you experience a genuine turning point, when conditions are present and catalyzing insight meets developmental readiness, creates specific recognizable changes that distinguish it from temporary motivation or understanding without integration. Remember that familiar cycle where you have insight, feel excited, make changes, then gradually slide back to old patterns? In genuine turning points, that cycle breaks. The change feels both dramatic and natural. You're not forcing yourself into new behavior through willpower. You're inhabiting development that's now available. Your old patterns become genuinely unappealing rather than just intellectually recognized as problematic. You're not resisting temptation to return to old ways. You've lost interest in them because your center of gravity has shifted. What used to feel normal now feels constraining or false. Your energy increases dramatically because you're no longer maintaining psychological structures that don't fit your actual development. The exhaustion that comes from living below your potential or against your nature dissolves when you shift into authentic alignment. Your decisions become clearer because you're operating from a more integrated developmental stage where your values, understanding, and behavior align. Confusion that characterized the preparation period resolves into clarity about what matters and what to do. Your relationships often transform. Some deepen as you become more authentic. Others naturally end as you outgrow the dynamics they were based on. People notice you've changed fundamentally rather than just temporarily. Even your physical presence often shifts. People report that those who've gone through genuine turning points seem more solid, more present, more themselves in ways that are palpable. Now here's where understanding turning points becomes practically useful rather than just conceptually interesting, and where this knowledge helps you work with your development rather than forcing change prematurely. The crucial recognition is that you cannot create turning points through techniques, willpower, or effort, but you can create conditions that make them possible when development has progressed sufficiently. First, focus on completing current stage work rather than reaching for next stage. If you're working on safety, build actual security. If you're working on belonging, develop real relationships. If you're working on esteem, build genuine competence. Each stage completed makes the next possible. Trying to skip ahead prevents the preparation that makes turning points stable. Second, pay attention to accumulating discomfort with current life structures. When career, relationship, location, or identity that once fit begins feeling constraining, that's signal that development is outgrowing current structure. Don't immediately try to fix the discomfort. It's information that you're ready for change. But also don't act impulsively. Let the discomfort build until the conditions for genuine shift are present. Third, expose yourself to alternative models, people living differently, ideas that challenge your current framework, experiences that expand your sense of possibility. You need glimpses of what's possible beyond where you are now, but without grasping at them prematurely. Fourth, practice gradually withdrawing investment from structures you're outgrowing. Stop putting energy into maintaining relationships, careers, or identities that no longer fit. This isn't burning bridges. It's allowing natural completion to occur. Fifth, develop capacity to tolerate uncertainty and transition. Practice being in not knowing. Sitting with questions rather than rushing to answers, allowing old structures to dissolve before new ones fully form. This builds a tolerance that makes turning points sustainable. Sixth, seek or create support for change. Therapy, mentorship, communities that understand transformation, or practices that support you through transition. Seventh, trust the internal pressure toward authenticity when it arises. When the gap between who you are and how you're living becomes unbearable, that pressure is trying to catalyze change. Don't suppress it, work with it. Here's the pattern Maslow documented about genuine turning points versus forced change attempts. Genuine turning points feel like recognition rather than effort. You're not making yourself change. You're finally able to implement understanding that's been building. There's often a quality of I can't not change rather than I should change or I'm trying to change. The shift feels inevitable in retrospect because the developmental preparation made it necessary. Forced change feels like constant effort, willpower, fighting yourself. You're trying to become something you're not developmentally ready to be yet. It's exhausting, usually fails, and creates shame when you revert to old patterns. Understanding this distinction prevents wasted energy trying to force shifts you're not ready for, while helping you recognize and work with shifts that are genuinely emerging. If you're trying to force change and it's not working, you probably need more developmental preparation rather than more willpower. If you're experiencing intense internal pressure and glimpses of different possibilities, you might be approaching conditions where a turning point becomes possible. The work isn't forcing the change, it's creating conditions, and then recognizing the moment when shift becomes natural. Maslow's insight was that development has its own intelligence and timing. Your consciousness knows when you're ready for quantum leaps and when you need more incremental growth. Fighting this wisdom by trying to force premature transformation or by suppressing genuine readiness both create problems. The skill is learning to work with your development rather than against it, supporting the preparation when that's what's needed, and allowing the shift when conditions indicate readiness. If you're watching this hoping for a technique that will transform your life in one step, I need to be clear. That's not how it works. What is possible is understanding the conditions that make genuine transformation accessible and doing the developmental work those conditions require. For some people, that work might consolidate quickly into a recognizable turning point. For others, transformation happens more gradually without dramatic moments. Both are valid developmental paths. What matters is doing the actual work of your current stage rather than fantasizing about dramatic transformation while avoiding the unglamorous groundwork that makes change possible. In the next video, I'm going to reveal the specific developmental work required at each stage of Maslow's hierarchy, what completing each stage actually looks like, how to know when you're ready for next, and what practices support integration at each level. Until then, assess honestly where you are developmentally and what conditions for turning points are present versus what preparation you still need. Real transformation requires both patience with development's timing and courage to shift when readiness arrives. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of how genuine transformation happens according to Maslow's research, including how to work with your development rather than forcing change you're not ready for or avoiding change you're ready to make.